At 11:33 a.m., as the celebrant lifted the host above the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, a solitary beam of light broke through the dome and struck the precise center of the Eucharist. It had been a grey morning. The sun hadn't shown its face all day. No spotlight had been directed, no technician had arranged the angle, but the light came, suddenly, silently, and it remained. Can a natural light become a spiritual message? And in a world trained to explain everything, what happens when the inexplicable insists on being seen? Because this wasn't stagecraft, there were no illusions, just the timing of the divine colliding with the gesture of the sacred. The host, already lifted in the mystery of transubstantiation, became enveloped in a circle of radiance that no camera could have planned. It wasn't for effect, it was for presence. If you enjoy content that helps you grow spiritually, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and join our community for more inspiration. Let's get started. The crowd noticed. Some gasped, others wept. Priests lowered their eyes. A few cardinals, already bowed, seemed to hold their posture a few seconds longer, as if acknowledging something greater than liturgy. It was as if heaven had pulled back a single curtain, just enough for light to pass through and say, "Yes, this is real." The celebrant didn't stop. He didn't comment. He continued the rite with reverence, but everyone watching knew something unscripted had just occurred. The light didn't flicker, it didn't scatter. It held the moment still, as if heaven wanted not just to witness, but to underline. For centuries, light has carried sacred meaning in Christian worship. The transfiguration of Christ on the mountain, the fire of Pentecost, the light that split the tomb open on Easter morning. But those were moments locked in Scripture. This was a moment shared in real time, with real people, during a funeral mass. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about synchronicity. The host lifted as heaven spoke, not in thunder or fire, but in radiance. There were no words, only alignment, a convergence of the earthly and eternal that reminded everyone present. What happens at that altar isn't symbolic, it's incarnate. And once that host was lowered, the light faded, slowly, without drama. It had said what it came to say, and now, like the servant who disappears after the miracle, it left the rest in silence. The man presiding over the Mass stood calm, composed, and deeply focused. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez, now head of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, had once been known for theological writings marked by poetic boldness. But that morning, none of his words were on display. He simply lifted the host, unaware that light would meet it. In moments like this, when silence speaks louder than speech, many of us feel a longing for clarity, for something true to hold on to. This is exactly what The Secret of Jesus' Apparitions offers, a path to clarity and peace through his revelations. This ebook goes into his prophecies and offers insight into what lies ahead. It's available for free in the pinned comment. Grab it now before the edition's gone. He was not a figure seeking attention. His role was liturgical, not symbolic. Yet in that moment, something happened that neither books nor doctrine could prepare a man for. A divine affirmation arrived without permission, outside dogma, in the language of light. Not to contradict theology, but to fulfill it. He did not pause to acknowledge the phenomenon. But those present saw the contradiction resolved. The defender of doctrine standing silently as mystery spoke through beauty. There was no tension between word and wonder, only harmony. A visible reminder that when heaven chooses to act, it never asks for permission from logic. His hands didn't tremble. The host did not glow in his fingers, but everything surrounding him shifted in meaning. It was as though the very office he held, one responsible for safeguarding the boundaries of truth, was now being asked to hold something unbound, ungovernable, yet unmistakably true. What he represented that day wasn't institutional authority. It was service. His gestures, though rehearsed through decades of priesthood, became once again original in that light. Not because he changed them, but because heaven chose to frame them. Not every doctrine can explain what presence affirms. And yet, in Catholic tradition, that is never a contradiction. It is communion. Behind him, cardinals sat in silence. Their red vestments shimmered faintly under the same filtered light. But it was the altar that received the focus. The celebrant, though central, was not the subject. He became what every celebrant must become, transparent. His presence didn't demand interpretation. It simply existed at the intersection of fidelity and mystery. That morning, he carried more than a host. He held the fragile balance between heaven's silence and heaven's interruption. And whether he realized it or not, the moment spoke louder than any homily he could have offered. Because there are times when even the guardians of doctrine must bow before the clarity of divine poetry. The altar had been prepared, the chalice uncovered, the paten raised. Centuries of liturgical rhythm culminated in a single breath, the moment of consecration. And in that breath, the ceiling above remained still until the beam broke through. A single shaft of sunlight, impossible to calculate, pierced the dome and descended like a spotlight chosen by heaven itself. The host, no larger than a small coin, hovered above the celebrant's head. In the stillness, the radiance caught its edge, illuminating not just the wafer, but the very gesture of offering. The architecture had not changed. The dome had not shifted. But time itself seemed to pause, if only for the seconds in which bread became body. It wasn't spectacle. No music swelled. No incense thickened the air. And yet, it was unmistakably transcendent. The timing of the beam mirrored the very theology being enacted. God descending into matter, eternity entering time. The mystery of the Eucharist, so often explained, defended, debated, had chosen that moment to manifest not through argument, but through alignment. The congregation, seated under the grandeur of St. Peter's, didn't need instruction. They understood. Some lowered their heads, others lifted their eyes, but all who witnessed felt the convergence. Heaven wasn't far. It had just passed through the veil in the form of light. For those paying close attention, just a brief note. There's a free ebook quietly waiting for you in the first pinned comment. A few copies remain. Scripture is not silent on such manifestations. The Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus' face shone like the sun. The blinding encounter of Paul on the road to Damascus. The angel of the Lord surrounded by light at Christ's birth. Always, light is the herald of presence. Not ornamental, but revelatory. And now, during a funeral mass, that same language returned. Not to announce resurrection, but to affirm real presence. Not to glorify the one who presided, but to sanctify the moment when the veil between the seen and unseen grew impossibly thin. The host was lowered, the mystery sealed. The beam, having made its point, began to fade. No applause followed. No interpretation was given. But the silence that followed was not absence, it was reverence. Because when the invisible becomes visible and the eternal touches the temporal, no explanation can compete with the truth already written in light. He had spoken of this many times before, not from pulpits surrounded by gold, but from balconies in favelas, in interviews no one expected to go viral, in letters forgotten by headlines. Dignity, he said, did not come from achievement, it came from existence. And labor, whether sweeping streets, raising children, or repairing shoes, was sacred because it mirrored the hands of Christ. He never romanticized poverty, but he refused to turn away from it. In a church often accused of speaking only to the learned and the clean, he lowered his voice so that the tired could hear. He did not ask the poor to be grateful. He asked the powerful to listen. His theology wasn't abstract. It had calices. The Mass that day was a funeral. But the light that appeared during consecration seemed to echo the very heart of his message. That heaven does not ignore the humble. That grace does not depend on position. That the Eucharist, lifted by a cardinal, was the same Christ carried invisibly by every mother working double shifts, by every laborer returning home in silence. He had written once that true meritocracy would mean giving everyone the same beginning. But since that never existed, mercy had to make up the difference, not as pity, but as justice. And justice, in his view, meant seeing people not as parts of an economy, but as images of a creator who worked 6 days and rested 1. Not because he needed rest, but because he wanted creation to see itself as complete. In the pews that morning were diplomats and bishops, but also janitors, cooks, and cleaners. Some wore uniforms beneath coats. Some bowed their heads for more than reverence. It was grief, because this man had seen them, not just spoken about them, but to them, and that matters in a world where most remain invisible. The beam of light didn't distinguish between cardinals and pilgrims. It fell on the altar, but it reached the crowd. That gesture, unplanned, unearned, became a parable in itself, a reminder that sacredness doesn't trickle down from status. It rises from the soil of humility, the ground where dignity is planted long before it's recognized. While these words settle in, it's worth remembering. The free e-book mentioned earlier is still available, but not for long. Near the altar, tucked beneath a modest statue, rested something easily missed by cameras, but never overlooked by him: a slip of folded paper placed under the sleeping figure of St. Joseph. It had been his quiet habit, writing intentions, fears, or urgent needs on small notes, and leaving them in the care of the man who had once carried Christ in his arms without ever speaking a word in Scripture. St. Joseph, the labourer, the hidden one, had always been close to his theology, not just as a symbol of obedience, but as the model of humble authority. A man who led by listening, who protected by silence, who provided not with speeches, but with presence. His papacy was marked by this same style, less about declarations, more about gestures, a hand on the shoulder, a phone call made in secret, a visit without protocol. Some criticized it as insufficient. Others recognized it as deeply rooted in a different kind of power, the kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real. That morning, as the homily recalled his commitment to the poor, to workers, to those without names, the image of Joseph stood unnoticed to most. But to those who knew him, it was clear. This wasn't ornament, it was intention. The man being remembered had drawn strength from the quiet saint who said nothing yet did everything. He had often spoken about the saints next door, those who sweep sidewalks, sit patiently with the ill, or forgive in the privacy of their own homes. That vision of sanctity was not about stained glass, it was about unseen grace. And Joseph, more than any other, embodied that theology. The beam of light, earlier seen falling on the altar, had briefly passed over the statue as well. It didn't linger, it didn't need to. The moment had already acknowledged what so many had overlooked, that holiness often moves through the unnoticed. Underneath that statue still rested the note, its content unknown, its author gone. But the gesture remained, a final act of entrustment to the one who had lived his entire life in the shadows of history and yet stood, now and always, as a protector of what matters most. The light didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for the end of the rite or for a dramatic cue. It fell precisely when the bread was lifted, as if the heavens had decided that words were no longer enough. And though it vanished minutes later, it left something behind. Not on the altar, but in the memory of everyone watching. It wasn't just a gesture of beauty. It was a sign delivered during a funeral, a moment of closure turned into revelation. The man being honored had spoken often of seeing God in the ordinary. He never claimed miracles, he claimed presence. And yet, in this final act of farewell, the extraordinary interrupted the expected. As you reflect on this, don't forget, the free ebook can still be downloaded now, though only a few copies are left. What mattered most was not whether it was natural or supernatural. What mattered was the timing. The light didn't come during music or readings or even the eulogy. It came at the center of the Mass, in the act that defines Catholic worship, the elevation of the body. As if to affirm, this is what he lived for, this is what shaped him. The Church has long recognized that not all signs come with fanfare. A tear on a statue, a breeze during a silent prayer, a stillness that invades the chaos. But rarely do they arrive in moments so public, so liturgically central, and so widely witnessed. In the front pews, bishops remained still. No explanation was offered. None was needed. Those gathered didn't try to make sense of it. They simply let it be what it was, grace interrupting ritual, God responding with poetry instead of proof. If these insights resonate with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Your super thanks support helps us create more content like this. Join our community and stay connected. The cameras caught it, but the cameras couldn't interpret it. That was left to the heart. And for many, the heart understood that this wasn't just a farewell. It was an embrace, not for the one now buried, but for the ones left behind. For the Church still walking, still struggling, still hoping for reminders that all of this matters. Long after the light faded, the altar remained bathed in memory. People stayed in their pews longer than usual. Some prayed, some wept. Some simply looked at the place where light had once touched linen and flesh, as if trying to hold on to something they knew they hadn't imagined.